Imagine a galaxy where humans were laughed at, mocked as primitive relics barely worth noticing. Now imagine those same primitive relics standing over the ashes of empires that underestimated them. What turned humanity into the most terrifying force the galaxy has ever seen? Stay with us, because the truth is far darker and far funnier than you think. This isn't just a story of war. It's a story of stubborn survival, ruthless wit, and how one messy, angry species changed the rules of the universe forever. Trust me, you'll want to hear how it ends. Welcome to HFY Sci-Fi Love and War Story, where humanity isn't just a footnote in galactic history, we're the warning label. Before we dive into the chaos, tell me, have you ever felt like the underdog everyone underestimated? Drop your answer in the comments, hit like, smash that subscribe button, and ring the bell so you never miss a story where Earth doesn't just survive, it makes the galaxy regret waking it up. And hey, if you're truly one of us, sneak the phrase "persistence beats perfection" into your comment. That's how I'll know you're part of the resistance. The grand assembly of galactic species was a roaring ocean of noise, light, and scent. 1,000 alien voices tangled together, some vibrating through the floor, others shimmering in the air like invisible needles. Captain Aiden Cross tried not to flinch when a nearby delegation sneezed a cloud of blue gas. He tugged at the stiff collar of his brand new Earth defense uniform, designed by a committee that thought imposing meant looking like a vending machine in polyester. "Relax," whispered Dr. Elara Monroe beside him, her own diplomatic robe already stained with something green and slightly smoking. "We're here to learn. Not to win a fashion show." Cross snorted. If this was humanity's grand debut among the stars, they were already about 3 wrong steps into slapstick. Still, he straightened his back. History watched. They entered the assembly hall under the massive silver banner of Earth, a simple blue sphere on white. The hall itself defied physics, a spiraling amphitheater suspended in zero gravity, rotating slowly so that every species had their moment in the center without moving an inch. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. And it smelled like burnt cheese. Across the swirling crowd, standing in rigid formation, gleamed the Valtheran Empire delegation. 2 meters tall. Armor that looked grown rather than forged. Faces sharp as knives and just as warm. General Vorik stood at their head, his golden eyes gleaming with a look that Aiden had seen before. Once, years ago, in the gaze of a man who had kicked a stray dog simply because he could. Monroe nudged him. "Don't stare. They can smell fear. Or so the pamphlet says." He would have smiled if his stomach hadn't been trying to strangle itself. As they reached the speaker's platform, the assembly quieted. Hundreds of alien eyes /U 2014 and other sensory organs more complicated than his last tax return /U 2014 turned toward him. Cross inhaled. This moment. This fragile, brilliant, terrible moment. He remembered his grandfather's stories, of wars fought over maps drawn by dead men, of brothers killing brothers because some king they would never meet pointed a finger. He remembered the pictures of graves stretching beyond sight. He remembered the silent guilt that hung in the air whenever old soldiers saluted the flag, not pride, but survival. And now here he was, carrying all of that bloody inheritance into the stars. He spoke. "Honored delegates of the Grand Assembly," he said, his voice steady despite the sweat sliding down his spine. "Earth extends its hand in peace. We bring our art, our science, and our hopes for friendship among the stars." A few beings clapped, tentacles, wings, pseudopods. Hope flickered. Then General Vorik stepped forward. Even his silence was loud. "You bring hope," the Valtheran boomed, voice dripping disdain. "You bring dreams? You are insects pretending to be lions." The words, translated instantly into dozens of languages, rippled through the hall like a slap. Cross swallowed. He thought of Monroe's words. "Here to learn. Perhaps we are young," he said carefully. "But youth brings new perspectives, new energy." Vorik laughed. It was not a hearty laugh. It was the kind of laugh you hear just before someone flips a table. The general sauntered closer, boots clanging on the spiral floor. With slow, deliberate contempt, he spat at the ground between them. A glob of dark fluid floated lazily in zero gravity, spinning like a tiny, vile planet. It brushed across his boot and splattered. The hall gasped. Some species recoiled. Others watched with hungry anticipation. Monroe whispered, "Tight, in Valtheran culture, that's a formal challenge. And in human culture," Cross muttered under his breath, "that's a damn good reason to punch someone in the throat." But he didn't move. Because every instinct honed by centuries of ugly history screamed at him, "Not here. Not now. Not yet." He wiped his boot slowly, dignity his only shield. "Thank you for your colorful greeting," he said, voice flat. Vorik sneered and returned to his place, satisfied. The assembly resumed, buzzing like hornets. The moment passed. Diplomacy survived, barely. As Cross left the podium, he caught Monroe's sideways glance. "You handled that well," she said. "Dignified. Stoic. Very grown-up." "Thanks," he said grimly. He glanced back at the floating glob of alien spit now drifting toward a delegation of feathered beings. "You know," he added dryly, "considering we just introduced humanity to the galaxy by getting publicly slimed, I'd say we're doing better than expected." And somewhere, far above their heads, Earth's official diplomatic motto floated in proud golden letters. "Earth, we try not to make things worse." It wasn't the first time humanity had been insulted by a self-satisfied empire. But there was something especially grating about hearing it announced across 50 languages, magnified by the Grand Assembly's acoustics, bouncing off golden pillars like an echo of cosmic mockery. "You bring dreams?" General Vorik's voice oozed amusement. "You bring hope?" Captain Aiden Cross stood at the podium, every instinct screaming at him to respond with the oldest, most honored human diplomatic maneuver, a punch directly to the mouth. But he didn't. Because somewhere in the back of his mind, beyond the heat rising up his neck, he remembered his father's voice, an old veteran of a forgotten war. The real battlefield is patience. The graveyard is full of men who couldn't wait 10 more seconds. Cross gripped the sides of the podium so hard his knuckles cracked. Vorik prowled forward, boots clanging like war drums, his scaled face twisted in a smile that promised violence without effort. And then, in full view of hundreds of species, he hocked a glob of black saliva at Cross's boots. In Earth culture, spitting was an insult reserved for the lowest scum. In Valtheran culture, it was worse, a formal declaration of dominance. Across the assembly, beings shifted uncomfortably. A species with translucent faces physically changed colors, half horror, half fascination. Some diplomats turned away politely, others leaned forward, savoring the ancient universal instinct to watch a train wreck. Cross stared at the wet stain sliding slowly across the gravity-stabilized floor. It shimmered there, mocking him. Dr. Alara Monroe, still standing rigidly at his side, whispered through clenched teeth. "Congratulations. You've just been officially invited to either surrender, die, or start a galactic bar fight." He could feel every eye in the hall stabbing into his spine. Expectation hung in the air like static electricity. He could retaliate. He could demand satisfaction by assembly code. He could unleash every bit of bottled human fury stretching back to the first stone thrown across a muddy field by a starving hunter. Instead, Cross bent down, pulled a handkerchief from his pocket /U 2014 white, embroidered, a gift from his late mother /U 2014, and wiped the glob clean in one slow, deliberate motion. When he stood, the handkerchief burned in his fist like a tiny funeral shroud. Cross met Vorik's gaze and smiled. Not a polite smile. Not a diplomatic smile. A human smile. The kind that had preceded every rebellion in Earth's bloody, spectacular history. "Thank you for your spirited greeting," he said, voice smooth as oil over fire. The room shivered. Vorik's smirk faltered, just slightly. Cross turned on his heel, walked back to Monroe, and whispered under his breath, "Tell me you brought hand sanitizer." She choked a laugh, quickly masking it with a cough. The assembly buzzed again, but the mood had changed. Some alien delegates exchanged glances. Others tilted heads thoughtfully. Because humanity had not reacted as expected. They had not raged like savages. They had not groveled like prey. They had absorbed the insult and survived it. And in survival, there was a deeper kind of threat. As Cross sat down at the Earth's assigned seats /U 2014 chairs too big, tables too low, lighting too bright /U 2014, he watched Vorak return to his delegation. The Valtheran general wore the expression of a man who had stepped on a snake and realized, too late, it was not dead. Is it bad, Monroe murmured, that I feel kind of proud we just got publicly humiliated? Cross shrugged, the corners of his mouth twitching. Pride is cheap, he said. Payback costs interest. He leaned back in his uncomfortable chair and studied the grand assembly, the swirling chaos of colors and languages and grudges. He thought of the wars Earth had fought. Not just the great ones carved into history books, but the small, stupid, endless ones, over land, over gods, over resources, over pride. Was this different? Was this better? He doubted it. Because no matter how many species built shining halls and wrote noble treaties, someone always thought they were better. Someone always believed violence was a shortcut. And someone /U 2014, the humans, usually /U 2014, had to remind them otherwise. Cross exhaled through his nose. War was stupid. War was bloody. War was inevitable when enough people forgot how bad it hurt the last time. Still, there was a kind of poetry in it. After all, humanity hadn't clawed its way from mud huts to the stars by politely declining invitations to disaster. Vorak was about to learn that the hard way. But not today. Today, Earth would endure the laughter. Today, they would bow their heads. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, they'd show the galaxy exactly why laughing at humans was a profoundly bad idea. Cross picked up his translation device and flipped it idly between his fingers, ignoring the Valtheran glares. He thought about the long history of humanity's response to insults. Dueling pistols. Midnight assassinations. Passive-aggressive Christmas cards. And sometimes, just sometimes, entire civilizations burning to ash because someone, somewhere, thought they could spit without consequences. Cross smiled. Congratulations, General, he thought. You've just started a fight with the only species petty enough to hold a grudge for geological epochs. The Hope's dawn drifted in the glittering void like a fish bleeding into shark-infested waters. To the untrained eye, it looked peaceful, a tiny blue and white against the grand black canvas. To Captain Aiden Cross, it looked like a funeral waiting for a name. The alarms began as a low, polite chime. Then they screamed. 3 Valtheran warships materialized from hyperspace, like wolves stepping from fog. Their hulls shimmered with the muted arrogance of a species that never learned to fear consequences. Lieutenant Kara Wells, manning the sensors, choked on her coffee. They're powering weapons, she shouted, uselessly, as if the universe might change its mind. Cross didn't waste time. Shields up. Evasive maneuvers. Broadcast diplomatic credentials. Because maybe, just maybe, this was a misunderstanding. Maybe the spitting and the insults and the general air of contempt had just been a colorful cultural tradition. Maybe Cross would wake up in his bunk and discover this was a dream caused by bad rations and worse whiskey. The first plasma bolt erased that hope. It punched through the Hope's dawn, shielding like a hammer through wet paper. The ship shuddered, lights flickering. Crew members screamed as consoles exploded, showers of sparks filling the bridge with the stink of burning plastic and fear. Cross braced himself against the impact. Damage report. Engines failing, Kara gasped, blood trickling from a cut above her eye. Shields at 20%. Life support, not feeling optimistic. Another impact. A brutal jolt. Cross swore under his breath, remembering the last time he felt this helpless, stuck in a bombed-out shelter during the New Mumbai riots, holding a dying boy's hand while the building above them burned. He could still hear that boy's ragged breathing sometimes, in quiet moments. War had a way of leaving souvenirs. "Prepare to abandon ship," Cross ordered. Dr. Elara Monroe gripped his arm. This was supposed to be a peaceful mission. Her voice cracked on peaceful, as if the word had turned to ash mid-sentence. Cross met her eyes. "So was every mission in human history," he said. "Right up until it wasn't." They moved fast. Escape pods launched like desperate seeds scattering before a wildfire. Crew rushed through smoking corridors, dragging wounded, coughing through the stench of fried circuitry. In the chaos, Cross caught glimpses, a young engineer sobbing as he tried to reboot a dead console. A security officer, barely more than a kid, whispering prayers from 3 different religions just to cover his bets. And all around them, the ship they had called home cracked and bled into space. Cross climbed into the last pod, Monroe collapsing beside him. He looked back through the tiny viewport. The Hope's dawn was a silhouette against the planet below, riddled with fire, beautiful in the way dying things sometimes were. "Goodbye, darling," he muttered, almost lovingly. The pod launched. Below them, the diplomatic vessel exploded. The shockwave shoved the pod sideways like a kicked can. Inside, everyone was silent. Shock, grief, and something harder to name hung heavy in the cramped air. Cross sat still, helmet cradled in his lap, heart hammering a furious beat. He thought of every time humanity had built something beautiful, cities, bridges, paintings, songs, and watched it get torn apart by arrogance, greed, or sheer stupidity. He thought about how, every time, they had built again. And every time, the rebuilding had been angrier, tougher, sharper-edged. War, he realized with bitter clarity, wasn't some ancient horror humanity had outgrown. It was the answer the universe forced you to write when the questions were written in blood. A proximity alarm chirped. The Valtheran ships were scanning the escape pods. "Maybe they'll let us live," Kara said weakly. Cross smiled grimly. "Maybe they'll invite us to their next poetry reading," he said. "Right after they finish vaporizing us." The pod rocked again, not a weapon strike, but a nearby pod exploding under fire. Monroe closed her eyes. "Any brilliant ideas?" Cross flexed his fingers, feeling the scars on his palms tighten, old burns, old mistakes. "Yeah," he said. "Hope they shoot straight. It's a quicker death." The others stared at him. He shrugged. "Hey," he added, "at least this way I don't have to sit through another meeting about proper handshake protocols." And somehow, that cracked the ice. Someone snorted. Then Monroe laughed, a brittle, painful sound, but real. In the blackness beyond the pod, humanity's diplomatic dreams burned quietly. And Captain Aiden Cross, floating among the debris of hope, prepared himself for the next inevitable step of human history. Survive. Adapt. Fight back. Preferably with fewer memos this time. The escape pod thudded into the dirt of some nameless moon like a thrown stone. Its hatch jammed, of course. Because when the universe decided to kick humanity, it never half-assed it. Captain Aiden Cross kicked the emergency release with enough force to remind his knee it wasn't 25 anymore. The hatch groaned open. He stumbled out into ankle-deep ash. The sky was a bruised violet, heavy with the wrong kind of stars. Around him, the surviving pods crackled as they cooled. Some didn't crackle. Some smoked, silent and final. Cross swallowed a curse. Dr. Monroe limped over, cradling her arm. Lieutenant Wells followed, dragging a makeshift medkit salvaged from the wreck. No speeches. No dramatic declarations. Just exhausted nods, the quiet ritual of survivors everywhere. In the distance, flashes of blue and red lit the sky, the Valtheran ships patrolling, hunting. "We're alive," Monroe said, voice like shattered glass. "For now," Cross agreed. He didn't say not for long. It hung in the air anyway, heavy as the ash underfoot. He knelt beside a broken pod, helping a bleeding technician crawl free. The man's uniform was scorched, his face a rictus of shock. Cross remembered another battlefield, the ruins of Venice after the climate riots. He remembered pulling a stranger from under a collapsed bridge, both of them coughing blood and laughing, because sometimes that's all you could do when the world fell apart. He remembered how the man had died 2 days later anyway, shot by looters for a bottle of clean water. Humanity learned to bury its dead quickly, if not quietly. Cross gritted his teeth. No tombstones here. No speeches. Only the silent understanding that they would either fight, or they would die. And humanity, historically, had been very bad at dying quietly. Night fell, if you could call it that. The moonscape turned blacker, colder. They lit small fires shielded by scrap metal, daring the Valtheran patrols to find them. They ate protein rations that tasted like hope if hope had been freeze-dried and soaked in battery acid. Someone produced a battered harmonica. Someone else sang, badly, until Monroe shut him up by pelting him with a rock. The survivors huddled close, trading bad jokes and worse stories, because that was what humans did when faced with oblivion. They built tiny, defiant bonfires out of shared misery. Cross listened, silent. He thought of Earth, spinning somewhere unimaginably far away. The green fields of Ireland where his grandmother had taught him how to curse properly. The humid summers of New Bangkok. The dusty libraries of old Chicago. He thought about how fragile it all was. Humanity had built its civilizations like children building sandcastles, daring the tide to come. And when the tide came, and it always came, they didn't weep. They grabbed buckets and rebuilt bigger. Maybe that was humanity's real superpower, stubbornness weaponized into art. At dawn, the patrols found them. The Valtheran soldiers descended like vultures, sleek armor glinting in the thin light. They expected surrender. They expected fear. They got Lieutenant Wells, who shot the first one in the throat before he finished his surrender speech. The camp erupted into chaos. Rocks became weapons. Broken scraps of potholes became shields. Cross tackled a Valtheran to the ground, punching the alien's rebreather until it cracked like cheap porcelain. Another soldier tried to flank them. Monroe threw a burning branch at his face. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't clean. But war rarely was. Cross felt something old and brutal wake up inside him, the same thing that had clawed its way through every human war, from sharpened sticks to orbital bombardments. The part of humanity that didn't die when the bombs fell. The part that built new bombs and threw them back harder. When it ended, it wasn't victory. It was survival, messy and miraculous. 8 Valtheran bodies littered the ground. 2 humans dead. 3 wounded. Cross wiped blood, not his own, thankfully, from his hands and stared at the smoking remains of the patrol ship they'd managed to hijack. It looked like hell. Perfect. We'll need a new name for her, Monroe said, breathing heavily. Cross smirked. How about diplomatic solution, he said. The survivors laughed, sharp, broken, but real. Because if there was one thing humans knew how to do, it was build something ugly and broken into a weapon. Preferably with bad jokes painted on the side. The diplomatic solution wasn't much of a ship. Its hull was patchwork metal, its engines coughed black smoke, and the targeting system had the aim of a drunken pigeon. But for a group of stranded humans trying to survive a war they hadn't started, it was beautiful. Captain Aiden Cross stood at the makeshift helm, surveying the broken terrain from orbit. Below them, the Valtheran outpost shimmered like a smug parasite clinging to the planet's crust. We hit them here, Lieutenant Wells said, pointing at a blinking sector map. Supply depot. No shields. Soft underbelly. Cross rubbed the bridge of his nose. Great. Let's punch them in the kidneys. Humanity's traditional introduction. Dr. Monroe chuckled darkly. If this works, we'll be heroes. If not, we'll be anecdotes. Cross smiled thinly. Either way, somebody gets a good story. They attacked at dusk, because that's when human history had always written its bloodiest chapters. Something about twilight made people reckless, too late to turn back, too early to regret. The diplomatic solution came in low, using terrain and broken satellites as cover. The stolen Valtheran transponder kept them hidden until the last second. They dropped from the sky like a drunken angel with a grudge. Explosions blossomed in the depot, turning sleek Valtheran logistics yards into flaming scrapyards. Cross led the assault team, rifle slung low, heart pounding a steady, hateful beat. He remembered, as he kicked open a supply building door, an old lesson from infantry training. Wars aren't won by killing enemies. They're won by breaking things faster than the other guy can fix them. And humanity had centuries of practice in breaking things creatively. Inside the depot, chaos reigned. Valtheran soldiers, and used to disorganized fighting, stumbled over burning crates and faulty shield generators. Cross moved through the smoke like a shadow, barking orders, laying explosives with the casual focus of a man wiring up a particularly rude birthday cake. Wells sniped from atop a wrecked hauler. Monroe rigged EMP charges along the communications arrays. They fought with the kind of desperate precision that only came from people who knew exactly how thin the line between survival and statistics could be. By midnight, the depot was an inferno. The humans fell back into the shattered landscape, dodging patrols and automated drones. They carried what they could: weapons, rations, and a half-functional Valtheran field generator that Wells claimed she could probably rig to make coffee. Monroe limped beside Cross, bleeding from a deep gash on her thigh. She grinned anyway, the wild grin of a gambler who knew the house was burning down but still had aces left. "Think they'll figure out it was us?" she asked. Cross laughed once, sharp and bitter. "Let's see," he said. Sabotage depot, missing supplies, human graffiti on the main console saying "Nice try, lizards." He shrugged. Could be anyone, really. The next few weeks blurred into a brutal rhythm. Attack. Retreat. Hide. Attack again. Small human teams sowed chaos far beyond their numbers. Bridges collapsed under passing convoys. Ammunition dumps mysteriously combusted. Valtheran officers found their command codes replaced with instructions for lasagna recipes. Humanity had no fleets, no massive armies, no fancy orbital bombardments. They had sticks, stones, scavenged weapons, and an unholy willingness to make war a miserable, unpredictable slog. The galaxy had laws for warfare, codes of honor, acceptable losses, formal surrenders. Humanity read those rules and used them for toilet paper. Cross watched it unfold with a grim satisfaction. He knew the history books liked to paint asymmetric warfare as noble. In reality, it was ugly, cruel, and personal. Every booby trap had a face behind it, a dead friend, a burned home, a child who didn't get a future. Humans didn't fight clean. They fought to win, because the alternative wasn't defeat. It was extinction. At a ruined mining colony they used as a staging ground, Cross sat by a fire, gnawing on ration bars that tasted suspiciously like recycled cardboard. Monroe joined him, her face gaunt with exhaustion. "You think the Valtheran are scared yet?" she asked. Cross shrugged. "They're confused. Fear comes later, when they realize we're not trying to win battles." He tossed a stick into the flames. "We're trying to break their will to fight." Monroe nodded slowly. "Sometimes I think," she said quietly, "that humans aren't survivors because we're strong. We're survivors because we're too damn stubborn to die on someone else's schedule." Cross chuckled. "Yeah," he said. "We're the universe's bad guests. Loud, messy, impossible to get rid of." A pause. "Also," he added dryly, "we steal the silverware." The fire cracked and popped, sending sparks into the broken alien sky. Above them, the war churned on. Below them, humanity sharpened its stubbornness into a blade the stars would not soon forget. And somewhere in the wreckage, Lieutenant Wells jury-rigged the stolen field generator to sputter out half a cup of bitter, scalding, barely drinkable coffee. It tasted like victory. Or possibly battery acid. But either way, it was better than the rations. The ruins of Outpost 17 looked like a graveyard built by a drunk god. Twisted steel. Half-collapsed bunkers. Burned-out supply trucks lying like the skeletons of extinct beasts. Captain Aiden Cross crouched behind a shattered fuel tank, hard hammering against cracked ribs. Beside him, Lieutenant Wells adjusted the scope of her stolen Valtheran sniper rifle, grinning like a woman who had personally offended karma and lived to brag about it. Down below, Valtheran reinforcements poured into the remains of their precious depot, scrambling like ants after someone kicked over their anthill. They wore polished armor, perfect uniforms, and absolutely no idea how to fight when the ground beneath them wasn't safe. Cross remembered his grandfather's words, muttered over whiskey and bad television. The first rule of war, kid, if you ain't cheating, you ain't trying hard enough. He gave Wells the nod. One shot. Straight through the enemy commander's stupidly ornate helmet. The Valtheran formation wavered, confused, leaderless. That's when humanity's second rule kicked in: kick him harder when they're down. A row of hidden claymore mines detonated along the ridgeline. The ground buckled. Screams tore the air. Valtheran soldiers fired wildly into the smoke, hitting everything except their actual attackers. Cross led the charge, gunfire rattling from every side. It wasn't a clean fight. It was a brawl, messy, personal, savage. The kind of fight humans had been perfecting since they first figured out how to sharpen rocks and grudges. Later, after the last Valtheran fled or bled, Cross sat amid the wreckage, nursing a broken hand and a cracked tooth. Monroe stitched a nasty gash on Wells' forehead while the lieutenant casually flipped her knife like a circus act. They had won. Not because they had better weapons. Not because they had better numbers. They had won because they didn't care about fighting clean. Because losing was a hobby humanity had never learned to enjoy. Cross stared at the horizon, where thick black smoke curled into the bruised sky. Somewhere beyond those mountains, other human units, small, under-equipped, angry, were repeating the same brutal theater. Sabotage. Assassination. Psychological warfare. The Valtheran Empire had expected a quick, surgical victory. Instead, they'd gotten 1,000 paper cuts from a species too mean to bleed out politely. The war maps changed overnight. What had been a neat border of conquest became a smear of red marks, lost depots, destroyed supply lines, planets temporarily lost to human insurgents. The Valtheran generals, raised on doctrine and superiority complexes, simply could not understand. They recalculated. They regrouped. They sent bigger fleets. Humans responded by blowing up their landing zones, hacking their comms to broadcast human pop songs, and reprogramming their supply drones to deliver live chickens instead of ammunition. War had rules. Humanity just couldn't be bothered to read the manual. In the stolen comms tent, Monroe decoded yet another intercepted Valtheran transmission. She chuckled grimly. "They're requesting more reinforcements," she said. "Specifically, units trained to handle unpredictable, chaotic, irrational enemies." Cross snorted. "So, toddlers?" Wells leaned back, cradling her rifle like a favorite dog. "You know what this means, right?" she said. Cross raised an eyebrow. "They're scared," Wells grinned, baring bloody teeth. "They're finally scared." It hit Cross then, a deep, almost sorrowful clarity. Fear was the last tool humans needed. Not to win quickly. Not to win cleanly. But to win permanently. Because humanity had always been underestimated. Too divided. Too emotional. Too self-destructive. Until someone poked them hard enough to stop fighting each other and start fighting back. Cross remembered the wars of Earth's past, the endless cycle of mistakes, regrets, rebuilds. He remembered history books filled with ashes and blood, always followed by stubborn, ridiculous hope. Humanity didn't survive because it was noble. It survived because it was too angry, too spiteful, too stupidly determined to stay dead. And now, for the first time in generations, that awful, magnificent trait was aimed outward. At an enemy that thought spitting on humans was enough to break them. Night fell again, this time with the sullen heaviness of a battlefield grown cold. Cross sat on a broken crate, running a whetstone over a bent combat knife. It was a pointless ritual. The blade was too warped to ever cut clean again. But it felt right, the small stubborn act of keeping something sharp in a world trying to blunt him down. Monroe dropped into the dirt beside him, her hand stained with oil and someone else's blood. "You think they'll surrender soon?" she asked. Cross shook his head slowly. "Nah," he said. "Takes a while for reality to beat the stupid out of a galactic empire." He paused, flexing his aching fingers. "And if it doesn't work?" He added dryly, "We can always send them a strongly worded letter. A beat. Written in high explosive." The tired, battered survivors laughed, real, ugly laughter, under the broken alien stars. Because if the universe insisted on treating humanity like a problem, well, they'd be more than happy to become its worst damn headache. The Varerii void cannon wasn't just a weapon, it was an insult. A declaration that negotiations were over, treaties were meaningless, and the only language worth speaking was annihilation. Captain Aiden Cross stared at the grainy satellite images, a monstrosity of alloy and arrogance stitched together in the orbit of the Valtheran homeworld. A weapon big enough to erase continents and egos alike. "You've got to admire their commitment," Lieutenant Wells muttered, chewing on a ration bar that might once have been food. Cross grunted. He didn't admire it. He understood it. Cornered predators always bared their teeth before they died. It was the part where they started gnawing off their own limbs that worried him. Dr. Monroe pointed at the display, her voice tight. "They're not just targeting our fleets. They're aiming for Earth." Silence thickened. Cross leaned back, feeling the full weight of centuries settle in his bones. Every war Earth had ever fought, every bitter peace bob with broken bodies, every lesson learned and then forgotten, all of it funneled into this moment. He thought about his mother's stories of the London evacuation, of hiding under stairwells while the sky rained fire, of her shaking hands when she tried to cook afterward, because the world had taught her that safety was just a polite lie. Cross had always thought humanity would be the ones to destroy themselves. Apparently, the galaxy just wanted a turn. The plan was insane. Which, given their track record, meant it was probably going to work. Cross and his team would infiltrate the orbital station housing the void cannon, plant charges along the firing coils, and detonate the thing before it could blast Earth into a smoking memory. Simple. Elegant. Only slightly suicidal. Wells patted the explosives bag like it was a beloved dog. "Just once," she said, "I'd like a mission briefing that doesn't end with, and then we run really fast." Cross smirked. "Where's the fun in that?" They launched at dawn in a stolen cargo shuttle, pretending to be technicians. The Valtheran guards barely looked up as the humans wheeled crates of death past their checkpoints. Arrogance, humanity's greatest enemy, but also its most reliable ally. Inside the station, the atmosphere was clinical, clean floors, white lights, quiet hums of power. It felt like a hospital. The kind that didn't bother scheduling checkouts. Cross planted the first charge under a coolant conduit, sweat dripping down his back. Wells rigged the main fire control system to overload, whistling a tune that sounded suspiciously like Another One Bites the Dust. Monroe tapped the timer on the last explosive. 10 minutes, she said. Plenty of time, Cross replied. He immediately regretted saying it. Because the station's emergency klaxons chose that moment to start howling like a banshee being chased with a hot poker. Security breach detected, the AI droned, in a tone suggesting it was deeply disappointed in everyone involved. Cross cursed. We've been made. Valtheran soldiers poured into the corridor, elegant, efficient, heavily armed. Wells dropped two before they finished their dramatic entrance poses. Cross led the charge down the hall, ducking plasma fire, returning shots with brutal precision. He wasn't aiming to kill. He was aiming to delay. Killing was optional. Getting Earth vaporized was not. They reached the shuttle bay just as the first tremors rocked the station. Explosions blossomed through the hull like fireworks designed by a particularly bitter pyromaniac. The void cannon shuddered, its firing coils snapping like overcooked spaghetti. Cross vaulted into the pilot seat, slamming launch thrusters so hard the whole shuttle moaned. Behind them, the Viriae station tore itself apart in glorious, vengeful pieces. The void cannon's death scream echoed across the void, a silent roar of wasted ambition. Wells hooped in the back, bruised and bleeding but grinning like a maniac. Monroe slumped into the co-pilot's seat, coughing. Cross kept his hands steady on the controls, flying through debris fields and prayers. They had done it. Earth lived another day. Hours later, floating safely in a human fleet's rendezvous zone, Cross finally let himself relax. He watched the shattered remains of the void cannon spin through space, a testament to the galaxy's biggest mistake: underestimating Earth. Wells tossed him a dented flask pilfered from somewhere. "Victory drink," she offered. Cross took a swig. It burned like betrayal and bad decisions. "Perfect." He handed it back, smirking. "You know," he said, voice rough, "I always dreamed of making a difference." He wiped his mouth with the sleeve of his torn uniform. "Just didn't think it would involve blowing up the interstellar equivalent of an angry phallic metaphor." Wells laughed until she choked. Because if humanity was good at anything, it was surviving absolute stupidity, their own and everyone else's. The Viriae capital burned with an elegance only civilizations could achieve when they collapsed in style. Captain Aiden Cross trudged through the shattered gates of the Imperial Palace, boots crunching over broken mosaics that had once celebrated 1,000 years of Valtheran supremacy. Now they celebrated only hubris. Around him, soldiers moved in cautious silence, weapons raised, eyes sharp. The air stank of scorched metal, blood, and the bitter reek of dreams dying. He remembered the fall of New Paris, the last war he'd fought before the stars called Earth upward. The same look in the ruins. The same heavy feeling in his chest. Not triumph. Not victory. Just the hollow ache of winning the argument after everyone else was already dead. The Viriae High Command was cornered in the Grand Chamber, still pretending they could negotiate terms, as if the universe gave a damn about their dignity anymore. Cross entered the room flanked by Lieutenant Wells and Dr. Monroe, both battered, both bloodied, both grim. The Viriae general stood tall, armored and defiant, right up until Wells casually shot the speaker podium with a stolen plasma pistol. The explosion threw sparks across the marble floor. Cross smiled without humor. "Let's skip the speeches," he said. "You had your chance." One of the Viriae, braver or stupider than the rest, stepped forward. "We demand honorable terms." Cross barked a laugh. "Demands? From the guys who tried to vaporize Earth because we made them feel short at a conference?" Silence. "You don't get terms," he continued. "You get consequences." He remembered the families burned alive at Alpha Centauri Station. The children buried under collapsed arcologies on Vega Prime. The endless casualty lists that had become their new national anthems. Humanity hadn't come for revenge. Revenge was petty. They had come for closure. And the universe was about to find out just how creative humans could be when given grief and explosives in equal measure. Outside the palace, a sea of Viriae civilians watched, trembling. They weren't soldiers. They were bakers, scholars, mothers, fools, the same fragile, stubborn mix that humanity saw every time they looked in the mirror. Cross felt the old, ugly temptation crawl up his spine, make them suffer. Make them remember. It would be easy. Too easy. But he remembered another lesson, older and harder to swallow. Monsters are made by forgetting you could have been one. He lowered his weapon. Wells grunted. "You're going soft, boss." Cross shook his head. "No. Just aiming higher." He activated his comm link. "Broadcast the terms." A loudspeaker crackled across the broken city. "This is Captain Aiden Cross of the United Earth Defense Fleet. The Viriae Empire is no more. Effective immediately, all civilians are to surrender peacefully. Medical aid will be provided. There will be no executions. No forced labor. A beat. But if you shoot at us, we will respond with overwhelming pettiness, followed by overwhelming firepower." The civilian stared. Then, slowly, a ripple moved through the crowd, weapons dropped, hands raised. Surrender, in the face of something far more terrifying than cruelty. A human willingness to forgive, but never to forget. In the days that followed, the rebuilding began. Monroe organized field hospitals from the wreckage. Wells trained Varerii volunteers in basic security. Cross spent his time writing reports that nobody would ever read, explaining why mercy was more terrifying than conquest. He remembered the reconciliation wars back on Earth, how enemies had been forced to sit across tables and share bread with the people they tried to bomb into dust. It hadn't fixed everything. Nothing ever did. But it had been a start. Humanity had learned one truth the hard way. If you wanted peace, you didn't just bury the dead. You buried the hatred, too. Preferably under a heavy slab of sarcasm and booby-trapped consequences. Late one night, Cross stood on a ruined balcony overlooking the battered Capitol. The stars shone cold and indifferent overhead, as they always had. He thought about the price of survival, the lives shattered, the future stolen. He thought about the stupid, stubborn hope humans carried like a disease. The knowledge that even after the blood and fire, they would still try to build something better, because giving up was just too damn boring. Wells joined him, sipping from a metal cup that definitely didn't contain regulation coffee. "Do you think they'll remember this?" she asked, nodding toward the city. Cross shrugged. "Maybe." He tilted his head. "Or maybe they'll write plays about how they bravely resisted the evil Earth invaders until we crushed them with sarcasm and second-hand duct tape." Wells grinned. "That's assuming they survive long enough to invent sarcasm." Cross laughed, deep and ragged. "At least we gave them something to aspire to." He raised an imaginary glass toward the smoldering ruins. "To humanity, proving across the galaxy that sheer bloody-minded stubbornness beats common sense every time." Wells clinked her cup against the air. "Cheers to that, boss." And somewhere, far beyond the wreckage and regret, the stars kept on shining, like indifferent gods watching toddlers learn fire. The Galactic Conclave smelled like polish, politics, and barely hidden panic. Captain Aiden Cross suggested the borrowed diplomatic uniform, too tight across the shoulders, too ceremonial to be useful, and tried not to look like someone who'd rather be back in a trench getting shot at. Across the hall, the new Varerii representative bowed stiffly. The scar across her scaled jaw was still fresh, a reminder that forgiveness, like most human inventions, came with teeth. Lisa Daniels, now Ambassador Daniels, caught Cross's eye and smiled, the kind of smile you wore when you knew the world still sucked but decided to dance anyway. The conclave speaker, a creature that resembled a tax accountant bred with a jellyfish, floated to the center podium. In recognition of the events that have transpired, it burbled, Earth is hereby offered full membership in the conclave of species. A polite smattering of applause rippled through the hall. Some tentacles wobbled. A few wings flapped half-heartedly. Most stared at the humans like zoo exhibits that had figured out how to open the cages. Cross resisted the urge to flip them all off with both hands. Instead, he straightened and walked forward, boots echoing across the marble floor. He thought about Alpha Centauri Station. He thought about the smell of burning families. He thought about the long nights stitching wounded soldiers back together with bloody hands and profanity. He thought about Earth, scarred and stubborn, still daring to exist. He accepted the conclave charter with hands that had built shelters and fired rifles and buried too many friends. The hall erupted in applause, genuine this time, or close enough for galactic politics. Hours later, after the ceremonies ended and the real work of pretending to like each other began, Cross escaped to the gardens outside the conclave. He sat on a cold stone bench, breathing in air that smelled like alien flowers and diplomatic lies. Monroe found him first, dropping a bottle of something that might technically qualify as wine into his lap. Wells arrived second, her new prosthetic leg clicking slightly with every step. She plopped down beside him with all the grace of a drunken rhino. They passed the bottle between them, no words needed. Victory tasted bittersweet. Because it was never really victory. Just survival with extra paperwork. Later still, a small group of species, those who had quietly backed humanity when it mattered, gathered around a fire pit. Cross told stories. Not the ones about honor and glory the history books would write. The real ones, about ration bars that tasted like dead dreams, about boots that never fit right, about laughing so hard during an ambush that Wells almost gave away their position. He told them about fear, about grief so heavy you thought your ribs would snap. About love, stupid, stubborn love, for a planet spinning in the void, filled with idiots who refused to give up. The aliens listened in stunned silence. Because nobody ever told them that humans fought so hard not for conquest, or revenge, or even pride. They fought because they remembered every small, stupid, wonderful thing worth saving. And because spite was cheaper than therapy. Near midnight, Cross stood and raised his battered cup. To Earth, he said. The others raised theirs. To a species that figured out how to turn pettiness into a survival strategy. Laughter rippled around the fire. The stars overhead burned cold and endless, vast and uncaring. Cross grinned up at them anyway, drunk on exhaustion and cheap alien liquor. He thought about all the empires that had looked down at humanity and seen nothing but primitives with guns. And how all those empires were now busy learning the difference between primitive and persistence with bad attitude. He leaned against Wells and Monroe, both half asleep and smelling faintly of blood, smoke, and stubbornness. You know, he slurred, if we ever do destroy ourselves, it won't be because we weren't strong enough. Wells snorted. It'll be because we couldn't decide whether to use nukes, sarcasm, or passive-aggressive memos first. Cross laughed until he choked on his own drink. Because deep down, every human knew the same stupid truth. They weren't the galaxy's strongest species. They were just the ones too damn ornery to stay dead politely. And really, wasn't that basically the same thing? And that's how a battered, underestimated planet turned the entire galaxy upside down, not with better weapons, but with sharper minds, blacker humor, and the sheer bloody refusal to lose politely. Now I want to hear from you. If humanity faced the real galactic community tomorrow, do you think we'd survive through diplomacy, or pure stubborn chaos? Comment your answer below, like this video, and make sure you subscribe to HFY Sci-Fi Love and War Story for even more brutal, hilarious, and unexpected tales of humanity outsmarting the stars. Because remember, in a universe full of predators, the most dangerous creature is still the human who refuses to quit.